Testing. Okay, sorry about that. Technical difficulties. Welcome everybody to another Fusion 360 Tech Thursday. My name is Brad Tallis. Once again, I have Angelo Juris as my wingman answering questions. So today we're going to talk about fixing some of the issues that have arisen creating the pencil sharpener parts. I'm actually going to start out by showing, I got this question quite a few times, like how am I coming up with these parts? How am I measuring them? And I will be honest with you, it's literally, I'm just using my digital calipers and I'm taking the parts and I'm like, for example, measuring wall thicknesses, and then grabbing that number and entering it in. Now, this works okay, but it can also lead to a lot of issues. A prime example is, on a part like this where it's got a lot of stuff on the inside, a lot of holes that are off center and stuff, it's kind of difficult to measure where those holes are, what radiuses are some of the fillets, etc. So we've introduced a couple little errors, and today we're going to fix those errors. So I don't know how much more detail I can get with how do I measure these parts. I literally I'm using the digital calipers. Sometimes I'm making approximations, etc. I will show you one little tip here in just a moment on how you can bring an image in and grab information off of that. So before we dive in, I do want to give a heads up. Next week is Autodesk University, and typically we hold it in Las Vegas. We invite lots and lots of customers and stuff like that, but due to COVID-19, we're unable to do that this year. So we are doing it online. So if you just do a search for Autodesk University or AU 2020, you can register. It's totally free. And I highly, highly, highly recommend that you do this, because there are a bunch of sessions, round tables. We're going to talk about what's coming out in Fusion 360, all of our different products. It's not just Fusion, it can be Inventor, etc. So due to the fact that AU is next week, we're not going to do a live stream next week, and then the week after that is Thanksgiving, so we'll continue our live streams at the beginning of December. So I just wanted to give you guys a quick heads up on that. Okay. Again, if you have any questions as we're going through, please feel free to ask Angelo, and I'll try and look at the chat every once in a while. Okay, so we've gotten this far with our assembly, where we've gotten quite a few parts. We started putting some things together, and I did get some feedback. People were saying, well, I don't think the gear lines up or anything like that, and we're gonna see what's going on. What we've been doing with this assembly is we've been designing what I call in context. And what that means is we're using one part to help us design the next part, to help us design the part after that, etc. And we're actually kind of building them in place, or we're building them, kind of at the origin and then moving them into place. And this is what I call in context design. Later on, I'm going to show where you create a single part, you bring it in, create another part, bring it in, and those parts are linked. We'll talk about that later on in today's session. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I have quite a few parts. I want to take a look at these, and because these are, cylindrical or whatever, it's kind of hard to see inside. So I'm going to do what's called a section analysis. So I'm going to say section analysis. It's asking for a face. I'm going to go ahead and just click on one of these origin planes, and you can see that it's going to slice through or section through. And you can move this section plane throughout your model however you want. You can even rotate it, which is kind of cool, and all that kind of stuff. I use this section analysis all the time. So let me go ahead and do that one more time. I'm going to click on this face, and then I'm just going to go ahead and say OK, and let's just kind of take a look at the front. Okay, I'm going to zoom up here a little bit. you can kind of see, it kind of shows what things look like, kind of sliced through. And last time we worked on this spring and this whole piston assembly, we kind of positioned it in place. But as we did that, we noticed that this part here is intersecting with this other part here, which I think it's called the gear housing, yeah. So we need to fix that, okay? Now, like I mentioned, if we had done each of these parts individually and then brought them into like what I would call assembly mode, where you kind of assemble things together, they'd be all linked and you could do what's called edit in place. But because we've basically designed one part after the other in context, we don't have that edit in place option. I am going to show that later, but we're going to do this a little bit differently. Now, some of you might just say, oh, click that bottom face of that part and drag it up the correct distance. And that's valid, but remember we spent some time creating sketches and adding dimensions and all that kind of stuff. Technically, it's better to go back and change dimensions and change your sketch instead of dragging faces. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the being able to do like this direct editing where you just click on something and move it and all that kind of stuff. But because we spent the time doing the parameters, you know, the dimensions, etc., we should go back and change the sketch. So that's what we're going to do in this case. So I'm going to make sure I'm seeing all of my parts and bodies just to kind of see what's going on here. So I'm going to right click at my top level. And you'll notice right here it says show all components and show all bodies. And every once in a while I'll do this. I'll just say show all components and then I'll say show all bodies. Now, why would I do both? Well, every once in a while something will become a body, like especially if you insert something maybe from a web page or McMaster-Carr or something like that, it might come in as a body. Now, we created all of these as components, which is the right thing to do. But I usually do both just to make sure, okay? And I'm going to zoom up so we can kind of see what's going on here. So I want to only focus on the particular areas that we are concerned about. So I'm going to click on gear housing, which is the part that it's intersecting into. And then I'm going to select part 4. And I'm also going to do the piston assembly. So I'm basically control selecting those 3 things. And then I can right mouse click and I want to isolate those. So watch what happens when I do that. It turns all of the other bodies and components off. So we're only seeing the parts that we're really concerned about. Okay. Now, this is part of the piston assembly, and so I'm going to activate the piston assembly. And again, the reason for that is notice my timeline, how long and complicated it is now. But by activating the piston assembly, we're only seeing the features that have to do with the piston assembly. Okay, give me just a second here, make sure everything's good. Okay. So Angela said no sound. Hopefully everything's working, but maybe that was earlier. So, okay, I'm going to keep moving forward here. So what I want to find out is how far did this part intersect? So I'm going to inspect measure. And here's a little tip. I see people do this all the time. They click on inspect and then they hit measure. Well, you can just hit the little ruler icon at the top and that takes you into the measure command. And I want to measure the distance basically from like this ledge here to like this ledge here. You'll notice since we're kind of slicing through, we get like points and stuff like that. It's because it can pick a whole bunch of different edges, different faces. But I know this is the distance I want to measure, so I'm going to go ahead and click there. And you'll notice I get a couple numbers that show up. It's kind of hard to see, but you'll see this 0.103, and then we see this 0.053. Now, why do we see these two measurements? Well, again, remember I picked these edges? Now, if I rotate, you're going to see, you know, they're at different locations, And so that 103, you can now kind of see in 3 dimensions. It's showing the shortest distance between those two edges in the 3 dimensions. But this 053 is the distance, and then here you can see that was that minimum distance right there. Now I care about this guy right here, and if I hover over the number, I can say click to copy to clipboard, right? So I'm just going to click on that, and it copied it into the clipboard. Now I showed this tip last time. I'm going to expand open my comments, and remember I had captured like the size of a gear or something like that. Well, sometimes I like to capture some of these measurements, especially if I'm going to be doing a bunch of different measurements. So I'm just going to paste that into my comments. That way I don't lose it, and I can always come back and recopy it. So I'm just going to minimize that out of the way. It's still copied into my clipboard, but that's an important measurement I don't want to lose. So I captured that into my comment. Okay. Now what we're going to do is edit the sketch. So remember, we're in this piston assembly. In fact, I'll expand this open. Let's take a look at the sketches. So I'm going to edit this very first sketch. Let me kind of zoom out so you can see this was kind of the defining shape. You can see it sort of highlighting on my screen. This was the defining shape of that piston. So I'm going to double click on it to edit that sketch. But you'll notice it kind of went away. Well, that's because, I don't know if you remember, we created these at the origin and then moved them into place. So I'm going to come down here, and here we can see all of the different measurements. Well, what I need to do is basically move this bottom edge up, but you'll notice that my sketch is fully defined. It has that little lock symbol on there. All of the lines are no longer blue. That means it's fully defined. So I can't click and drag this up or anything like that. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this corner here, and you see that we can, a little icon appears, and that is the coincident icon. Actually, I'm going to do it, let me do it on this corner here. I want to keep that one coincident. I basically want to move this line up a little bit. And so when I click on that origin, I get these 2 coincident icons. And these are the constraints, the coincident constraints. So I'm going to click on that first one there and hit the delete key. And you'll see that everything else turned blue. Okay, so I don't want that. So let's do that again. I'm going to click on this one. This time I'm going to click on this guy over here and hit the delete key. And I get the same result. So it's the exact same result here. And you'll notice if I try and drag this line up, it doesn't. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that other constraint. And now you can see I can move this whole thing up and off of that origin. So I get this question quite often, like, okay, everything is constrained. Let me undo. How do I unconstrain it? Okay. You'll also notice I have a dimension here of 1.2. I'm going to go ahead and let's just select that guy and delete him off of there. And you can see some lines change. I'll do these guys again real quick. I'll delete that one there. And now you can see by deleting that constraint, it allows me to move this whole thing up off of the origin. So you can kind of see there's still a line that goes all the way down. So that was one of those constraints. But I unconstrained this horizontal line. I know this is kind of confusing, but basically this horizontal line was constrained and this vertical line was constrained, and that's why we saw those 2 constraints. But by deleting one of them, I'm now able to move this line up or down a little bit. Okay. Okay, so I want to, let me see what I'm going to do here. Let me see if that changes. No, it moves everything. Okay. It's a little bit different than what I was doing earlier. Yeah, so there you can kind of see if I come down, that line doesn't exist there anymore because they're no longer constrained with each other. Okay, so I want to move this line. Let me do this real quick. Sorry. Let me go here. So now what I want to do is I want to move this line the correct distance. Okay, it's being controlled by this 1.03. So I'm going to come in here and say I want to basically make this shorter by a very specific distance. So I'm going to do the 1.03 and type in minus, and then I'm going to paste. So I'm going to Control V, and we can see that 053 shows up. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and now you can see that it moved exactly the distance that it was supposed to. So instead of just dragging, we're basically saying move this line from where it was sunk down into the part. Let's move it up a little bit. Okay. I also see that some of these lines are blue, so I'm going to go ahead and throw that dimension. I probably shouldn't have deleted that 1.2, but I can see that this line is still blue, so it's not fully constrained. I can see that by that icon there. So I'm going to throw a dimension from here to here, and I'm not going to change the number because it's correct. I'm just going to hit enter, and you can see that by throwing the dimension on there, it fully constrained this sketch. Okay. If I try dragging things around, we should see that it doesn't change. Okay. Now notice this guy, I'm dragging this guy around, so I should probably say I want that one to be coincident with that edge there, and now I can see that there's a lock symbol on my sketch. I know that this is fully constrained. So I'm going to say finish sketch, and let's see what happens here. So it does a little bit of calculation. I'm going to zoom back up, and we can see that this part now sits where it needs to sit. Okay, instead of being down under. So remember, just as a quick review, we took a measurement from this edge to the other edge where it was sunk down, and we captured that distance. We went back to the defining sketch and just changed its height by what that exact dimension was. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Moving forward here, I can also see, let me change my section view here real quick. I'm going to edit this guy. Let me see what's, there we go. Okay, I just wanted to kind of look at this distance here. Now I should have shown it before. This was a little bit lower, and because we updated, man, I'm trying to having a hard time explaining this. This edge was a little bit lower because there was a certain distance on this sketch. Let me just show you. Let me back up here real quick. Right here, this 0.42, it used to be down here, which means this ledge used to be a little bit lower. And so before we made these changes, there was a little bit of a gap right here. Now that gap still exists, but it's a little bit smaller than what it used to be. Again, this is one of those errors that was introduced by it's kind of hard to measure into an object exactly and all that kind of stuff, and maybe I just made an approximation, and then now when we're starting to assemble these parts, we can say, you know what, those probably need to be closer together. So let's go ahead and fix this. So here's a neat tip. I really like this tip, and not a lot of people know about this. So if I hover over this, I can see that that's sketch 1 of the piston assembly. Okay, sketch 1 of the piston assembly. So I'm in my piston assembly. Here's sketch 1. I'm going to go ahead and turn that sketch on, and I can see it. But if I right click on it, I can say show dimension, and it's actually going to turn on all of my dimensions. I can even reposition these dimensions. So here's that 0.42. this is the dimension that kind of defines that ledge. So let's come in here and say like 0.43. Let's just see what happens. And you'll see that after I change that, it's going to update my sketch, and it's going to update my 3D model. In fact, let's go to 0.45. I'll hit enter. You'll notice it calculates really quick, and there it's changed, and we get the correct spacing that we want. So you can come in and tweak these dimensions without having to go back into the sketch itself. I think this is a huge tip. Give me a thumbs up if you like this one. Hopefully you already knew about this, but it's really kind of an easy way to make dynamic changes, especially like in a section view like you see here. And then if you want to, you can right mouse click and say hide dimensions, and the dimensions go away. Okay, so now we have the gap. Looks really good. Let's continue on. So we've kind of fixed that issue where this piston assembly now sits in the correct location. We get good clearance right here. If I zoom up a little bit, I notice that this blue part looks like it's intersecting this peach or orange part. So we can kind of see that there's an issue there. So again, you know, off by just barely, hardly any at all, but enough that those parts wouldn't fit together. Okay, so again, I'm going to measure, but I'm going to measure in 3D. So check this out. I'm going to click on measure, and I'm going to rotate a little bit. I want to measure this diameter here and this diameter here. So I could do it, you know, looking straight on. It's kind of harder to see what's going on, but you can always rotate in a section view. So I'm going to say I want to measure that distance, or I'm sorry, that diameter, and that diameter there. Okay. And you can see it gave us a lot of information. So my first selection, which is tagged with a 1, there's that diameter. And then the second selection, there's that diameter. And we can see this minimum distance. So I'm going to go ahead and, again, click to copy that into the clipboard. And let's just paste that just to capture that one. So I'm going to paste that one in there, minimize my comments, and I'll go ahead and close my measurement. So now I kind of know what the distance is. Okay, so I'm going to, that has to do with the piston. If I hover over the word piston, I can kind of see it highlighting. That's the thing I want to change. I want to make sure it's going to slide into the gear housing. So I'm going to activate my piston. And sure enough, there's my features for creating that piston. Let me just go ahead and expand this open so we can see the sketches there. Okay. I'm just going to kind of zoom up so we can see what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and edit the first sketch that kind of defines the overall shape. It's probably down below. Yep, it is. So here is that sketch that kind of defines the piston. Okay. Which is right here. So we can kind of see this is the profile that we used to rotate or revolve around. Okay, so here is that diameter of 0.4. This is kind of what defines the overall diameter of the part. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this dimension. Now, I'm actually gonna back up because I've shown two different methods, and the second method I actually liked much better. So here I'm editing this sketch by editing that feature, so I can do it that way, or I can do it here, right? And this is the thing I was showing earlier. I'm going to turn on that sketch. I'm going to show my dimensions. And to me, this is so much easier to see what's going on because the sketch is right where it needs to be. I can see important dimensions. So again, just showing you two different methods. I personally like the show dimension method. Let's go ahead and edit this guy. So 0.4 is too big, so I'm going to say minus, and then I'm going to paste in that number. And watch what happens when I hit enter. It updates, but we're still clashing. Okay, so why is that? Well, that's because that was that minimum distance for the radius, and we want to do the diameter. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this number again, and I could, mathematically I could say, oh, it's supposed to be 0.01, but let's let Fusion do the work for me. I'm going to say times 2, and watch what happens when I hit enter. And now we get the result that we want, where it fits inside 0.39. Now remember, this was 0.39 and now this is 0.39. Maybe we want a little bit of clearance. So this is where I can come in, and this is why I like leaving that number. I can come in and say, you know what, let's just make that a little bit bigger, 0.06 times 2, and now we can see that we definitely have a little bit of clearance in here between the two parts. Okay, so I'm using the actual measured distance. I copied and pasted it. I didn't have to type it in or anything like that. I could have introduced an error by typing something wrong. We're actually using information from Fusion itself, and it's doing the math for me. So, and then I can come in and tweak with this, right? I could even do something like this, which is pretty cool. So instead of times 2, I could come in here and create a parameter. So I could create a user parameter called like tolerance, or TOL, and I want it to be 0.002 or something like that. And when I'm in here in this dimension, I could say I want it to be that number, plus whatever my tolerance is. I'm going to start typing in TOL so you can kind of see that. Oops. Let me get rid of that I. So you can see it's going to take that number, and then add a little bit of a tolerance to it. And it's going, you can kind of see it went in the positive direction, but I can make it go in the negative direction, for example. So mine is tall or whatever. So you get the idea. You can do whatever you want. You could add in that tolerance, and I probably need to do it times 2 also. So kind of a cool little feature there. You can create a variable and then do whatever you want with that variable. So I'm going to do that 0.06 again. There we go. Okay. So now we've fixed that particular issue. Okay. Looking at my outline real quick, just to make sure we're hitting all the key points that I want to hit. I'm going to turn off my sketch so we can kind of see what this looks like. We fixed that, we fixed that. That's looking really, really good. Okay, the next thing I want to do, I'm going to turn on this cutter assembly, and I'm going to go ahead and activate the cutter assembly because we're going to work on this next. I can visually see that this probably needs to sit down, to slide down into this area right here, and it probably gets stopped by the edge of this piston assembly. And this is the issue we ran into, and I'll be the first to admit, here's the part, it's kind of hard to see where those teeth are, so I just said, oh, they're near the top or whatever. I didn't even measure, and here they are at the top, but in reality they're actually supposed to be here. So we're gonna have to fix a pretty major change. So we're gonna get to that here in just a minute, but that was one of those assumptions that unfortunately is gonna cause downstream processes, but we're gonna fix that, okay? Okay, so I wanna move this assembly to where it needs to go. So I'm going to, if I just grab on it, you can see it can free float around, which obviously we don't want. I want to build some smartness into it, so I'm going to do not a joint command, but an as-built joint, because it's already where it needs to be, mostly. I don't need to specify, go from this edge to this edge, or this point to this point. I just basically need to say, I want to slide this part up or down. So I'm going to do what's called an as-built joint. So I'm going to say as-built joint. what are the components? I'm going to go ahead and select the this guy here, okay, and this piston here. Now by default it says it's a rigid, so you can kind of see rigid. I'm going to change this to slider, and now it's asking for an origin on a component, like which direction is it going to slide. All I have to do is like get near like a vertical edge or something. It really doesn't matter. Even like a cylindrical edge, it doesn't matter in this case. I'm just going to click on an edge like that, and there's a part there that's being sliced through. That's why you see those little faces right there. And we can see that now that part can move straight up and down. Okay. So now I'm going to grab it and drag it down. And so you can kind of see, okay, it can slide just up and down, but we don't know how far we want it to go. I could measure, but I like to look at this as like we're assembling this part together. You know, these parts are going to fit together, so we'll let Fusion do the work for us. Okay, so we're going to use what's called a contact set. What this is going to do is it's going to analyze when parts are going to intersect or clash with each other. So I'm going to say new contact set, and I want to know when that part contacts the piston. So I just clicked the cutter assembly and the piston. I'll say OK. If I grab this, you can see I can still move it up or down. But as I drag down, you'll see it's going to hit the piston, but we see an issue. It's now moving the piston down also, and the spring and all that kind of stuff. So it did what we asked it to do, but not quite, okay? It hit it, and then it continued pushing that one. So we need to tell the piston not to move. Now, in reality, it's going to, right? It's going to get pushed down, you know, and then the spring is going to push it back into place. But just in this example here, we want it to sit on top of that. So we need to ground the piston component. Oops, hit my 3D mouse. So I'm going to click on the piston component, right mouse click, and you can see one of the options is ground. So I'm going to say ground. It puts a little pin icon next to it. If I were to try and drag this piston, I'm clicking and dragging, you'll notice it doesn't move. But this guy does. Okay. Now as I bring it down, you'll see I'm still dragging down, but it has finished moving because it's hit the top of the piston. And the piston can't move because we told it not to move. Okay, here is a tip. When you're doing this moving and you drag it down and it stops, I recommend zooming up. And you can see there's a little bit of a gap, and I'm going to grab this and come back down again. And so sometimes you'll want to get as close as you can. Now so you can see I'm able to basically close that gap by zooming in. Okay. So what it's basically doing is it's doing a live calculation as you're dragging it down, and mathematically it's solving that. By zooming in, it's getting, basically a higher resolution. It's saying, okay, now it's 0.0003, now 0.0002, etc. Where out here it might be 0.01, 0.02, 0.03 or whatever. So I usually zoom up just a little bit and continue dragging just to make sure that it's fully seated where it needs to be. So just a little tip. Now, could we have measured the difference, where it was? I could have taken a measurement from there, a measurement from there, and then move it down that exact distance? Absolutely. That's totally viable solution. I'm just showing you different methods for being able to do this. And like I said, this kind of gets assembled together. And so we can kind of see how this is just going to sit down on those parts, like so. I'll capture that position. So now it is in the correct location. And we can see it's still being supported by this blue part here, or the cyan part, etc. Okay. And I know I kind of went through it pretty quickly. After I move this, you'll notice an icon appears up here for capture position or revert. Once I had it where I wanted it to be, I did a capture position. Okay, I want to tell Fusion this is exactly where this part needs to be. Let me zoom up a little bit and drag this guy down. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and capture that position. It captures it into the timeline for me in the cutter assembly. Okay. Now what we need to do is we need to fix this internal gear, because now it's going to be hard to see. Let me edit my section. So I'm going to say edit. I'm going to go ahead and rotate this around a little bit. So we have this cutter gear, and again you can kind of see this part is intersecting with this part here. I am not going to resolve that. Just I made a mistake. I apologize. We're not going to 3D print this and make it work or whatever, but you can see it is intersecting. I'd probably have to go back and change the diameter of my cutter assembly, all that kind of stuff. Again, it was just taking approximate measurements, but I was obviously off a little bit. But I want to have this gear rub against this gear up here, which is supposed to be down here. So we're going to fix this issue. I'm not going to fix this issue. I challenge you to go and maybe change the diameter of this, or maybe change the angle of it or something like that. But we're only going to fix that one particular issue. Okay, so I'm going to, we're basically this part here. If I click on it, you can see it highlights part 4. See those little lines underneath? If I click on this guy here, it'll highlight the whichever one that is. I don't see it. Let me do this guy. There we go. Oh, it's part 4 also. Let me just do a different one here. So that's the gear housing, etc. So I want to work on this part, so I click on it. It's part 4. I'm going to go ahead and isolate it. So I'm going to say unisolate. And then I'm going to say isolate. So I had already isolated a bunch of parts, so it had me unisolate first, and then I could say I only want to isolate part 4, and I want to activate it. Okay, so there's our part. So what we need to do is, I want to kind of take a look at this. I'm going to turn off my section analysis, and notice the steps to create this part. I keep highlighting this. It's so much simpler to work in components than it is to do really complicated timeline. So in fact, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to back up to the very beginning, and then I'm going to step forward. So if I hit play, it's going to go through every single step, and I can't really stop it. But with this guy, I can click on next step, and so it just did all of these cylinder primitives. That's how we started. And then my next step was to create a hole, and then we shelled the part out, right? And so I can just keep stepping forward. We did the fillet on the top, we did the fillets on the edges. So I'm going to keep stepping through until we get to, and I'm going to look at it this way, until we get to this gear. So I'm kind of looking for that gear to appear. So not yet. That's just where we did the teeth on the outside. And then right there, the very last step is a combine. And I don't know if you remember, we used a plugin, the FM gear plugin, to create a gear. And then we combined it to part 4. Well, this is wrong, and it's the wrong size, so I'm going to right click on this combine. I'm just going to say suppress features. Okay, and we don't need this internal gear anymore, so I'm going to right click on it and say remove. And you'll notice that it's no longer in my browser because we've suppressed that guy there. It's not going to be calculated anymore, and we basically removed that gear out of our design. So what I want to do now is create a new gear. So I'll do the create FM gears, We're going to do an internal gear, and the numbers that I'm using are in the outline, which are attached to the video. So if you want to go through the outline, you can see it. So outer diameter is supposed to be 1.5. The diametral pitch is going to be 32. The number of teeth is going to be 34. And 0.01 and 0.15. Okay. Now you're going to notice something interesting when I say okay. It's going to create this gear for me. You can kind of see it building it down here. Okay. And you'll notice that it's ghosted out. And that's because it's its own component right here. Then we're going to position this into place. So I'm going to use the joint command. I'm going to say, you know, that circular edge. And then I want to be careful. I want it to go on either this edge here or this edge here. It really doesn't matter as long as it's on one of these lower shelf circular edges instead of the way up here like it used to be. So I'm going to click on this edge here. And then I can see it put the gear there, but it's inside this other part. So it's flipped. So I'm going to click on this little flip icon, and you can see we can change the orientation. Is it going up or is it going down? Well, we want it to come down. And you'll notice with the dimensions that I used, it just barely creates some teeth on the inside, but you can see that the gear is sticking way out on the outside. And we'll fix that here in just a moment. But this is the important part. And again, it's probably really hard to see, but there's, and I won't even focus, those teeth are just barely sticking out of the part. So that's what we're kind of recreating here. So I'm going to go ahead and say okay. We now have two separate parts. You can kind of see they're two different colors. So we have that gear and we have this part 4. Okay. Now, if I were to try and combine these two together right now, I would basically be changing the overall shape of my design, which obviously we don't want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I'm working on the internal gear. So I'm going to activate the internal gear. Sorry about that. Okay, so now we can see that the other part ghosts out, and then we see the gear is shaded, which it means it's the object we're working on. It's the component we're working on. Then what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to just make the outside smaller. So I'm going to click on this face and do a press pull. Now you'll notice if I start dragging, nothing happens, which is really interesting. And this kind of confuses some people. They're like, whoa, that's a simple cylindrical face. Why is that not changing? Well, right here, this offset type, you can see is set to automatic. And then we have some options here. So we could say modify existing feature, or we could say I want to do a new offset. So I'm going to say new offset, and now you'll notice I'm able to define what that offset is going to be. Okay, so try changing from automatic to maybe try modify existing feature or something like that. See if that works. That one doesn't. Okay, so then I'm going to come in here and say new offset, and that does work. Okay. Then all I'm going to do is make it small enough that it kind of goes inside this other body. So you can kind of see we still see the gears, but now this whole part is basically intersecting this part 4. Okay. So now I'm going to activate part 4. We don't see that weird gear sticking out anymore. We can still see it on the inside. And now I want to combine these together. So you'll notice I suppressed that combine, but I can come in and create a new combine. So my target body is going to be this guy. My tool body will be this gear. I want to join them together. And I'll say OK. And we now have this part 4. If I turn that on or off, we can see that all those teeth are part of this object. And we were able to basically recreate it where we needed it to be. Kind of a major design change. We removed the old one, and then created the new one. Now this is basically an empty component. It no longer has the body anymore because that was combined with part 4. So I could go ahead and remove that other component. It was just kind of empty. There was really nothing important there anymore. Okay, so we've fixed this. And you can see the new combine at the end of my timeline. Okay, let's take a look. Let's go to this top level assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and activate that. I'll do the right click again where I can say, show all components, show all bodies. And when I say show all components, okay, and I say show all bodies, how come it looks like I'm missing some parts and missing some fillets and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't look like what it used to look like. Okay, so I'm at the top level, and here are all of the steps for my design. So I'm going to kind of scrub through. I'm going to start dragging to the right. Keep going, and then you'll notice there are a bunch that are grayed out. A lot that are grayed out. Well, why is that? Well, remember, I kind of went back in time. We edited some parts and we kind of changed some stuff. So that was basically at this point in time. So I'm going to jump to the end of my timeline. So I could go step by step by step, or I can hit this move to end and watch what happens when I do this. I'm going to say move to end. And you can see it's computing and it's calculating, but we get some issues, okay? You'll see we get some issues there, so we're going to have to resolve those. But now you'll notice I'm at the end of my timeline. But as I scrub back, I can see that I've got some red issues. Okay, and you guys are probably like, woohoo, Brad finally gets some errors, because I hear all the time, it's like I'm going through your designs, I'm doing it step by step, or for whatever reason I get an error. It happens to me too. And we're going to walk through how do we fix this, what caused the problem, etc. So, okay. I can also see that some of my parts are still turned off. I can turn these guys back on. I could right click here, do show all components, and now my parts are showing back up. But I wanted to highlight that where you say show everything and things aren't showing up. The first thing I do is I check my top level timeline to see if for whatever reason we're back in time somewhere. Okay, so I'm going to hover over this first red issue, and it says it's a split command in the cutter assembly. And that's key, okay? So I know it has to do with the cutter assembly. So I'm going to come in here and activate the cutter assembly. Notice we now see the timeline for the cutter assembly, and inside it's showing those 3 errors. So actually, all 3 of these errors have to do with just that assembly, which is good. I know you're like, an error is good. Well, the fact that it's just, it's all in one assembly, that's much better than being spread all through my whole design. Okay, so once again, I'm going to hover over this. I can see that it has to do with the split of the cutter assembly. In fact, just to simplify things, let's just isolate the cutter assembly. So we're only seeing that. I think it's much cleaner, much easier to see. And then I'm going to edit this feature. Okay. Now, actually, you know what? Let me back up. I'm going to click on this guy and say review warning. So first thing I usually do is I review the warning, and it basically says the compute failed, no intersection between target and split tool. Okay, that kind of gives me a clue of what's going on. Now, what does that mean? I have no idea, right? But it said something about the target and the split tool. So I'm going to edit this feature. And there's my body to split, that's the target, and there's my split tool right there. And you'll notice everything kind of looks okay. But what I'm going to do in this case is basically just reselect things. So let's expand open my bodies. I'm going to turn off, or I'm going to hit this little X next to body to split. I'm going to hit the little X next to splitting tools. Well, I know in this case my body to split was this, this webbing that we created, this ribs. So I'm going to click on that guy. My splitting tool, well, I remember we created that surface. So I'm just going to kind of hover through here and kind of see which one of these. So that was the surface that we used. We kind of grew that surface. I don't know if you remember that. But now I'm going to say my splitting tool is that surface. I'll go ahead and extend that just in case. I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And it's going to calculate and see if it can do it. And not only did it do it, it actually fixed the other issues by just basically redefining the body that we were splitting and the splitting tool. Now, again, I really honestly can't tell you why did that fail. It might have been, something that we, a dimension that we changed, or a face got moved that it was referencing or whatever. That's what typically causes these error messages. But you can see just by going back into the feature, and sometimes as easy as just reselecting it, sometimes it's even as easy as editing the feature and then just saying okay, and it kind of recalculates and figures out what it needs to do. But in this case, it actually fixed all of the issues for me. I'll go ahead and activate my top level assembly. I'll unisolate all, and now we are back to our timeline. I'm going to kind of scrub through real quick. So there's one more error here, and this was my fault. I removed that gear. I probably shouldn't have removed it. So, I could just go back and unsuppress that or whatever, undelete it if I needed to. But let's just take a look at this. So it says, can't delete an instance that's already deleted. So I basically deleted it, and then later in my timeline I said, oh, now delete it. But I had deleted it, previously or something like that, for example. So easy fix. Okay, so I'm going to keep scrolling through, and everything looks good. Okay, so I think that was it for that. We have just a few minutes left. I'm going to show the example of using the edit in place. So what I ended up doing for this, I'm going to go ahead and open this guy up. I basically just saved all of these parts out individually, okay? And then I brought them in. I basically came in and said, it's still loading. I said insert into current design, insert into current design, insert into current design, and we get the exact same deal, but you'll notice these are all linked. Okay, they have these little link symbols next to it. Okay. So instead of having to go in and edit a sketch or whatever, I could come in here, and this is the piston assembly. So let's go ahead, and you can see there's a little pencil icon that says edit in place. So I can come in here and say edit in place, and it's going to tell me, okay, associativity is turned on. References to other components will be captured in an assembly context. You can toggle, etc., etc. But this is good. You're going to see the benefits of this. In fact, I'm going to say OK, and you'll see right here at the top this little icon that says End Edit in Place. Now it's going to be kind of hard to see, but notice all of these say version 1. That's going to be really key here, okay? Except for the very top level, that's version 2, don't worry about that. But these all say version 1. Okay, so now I'm editing this piston assembly in place, right? I'm not having to open it separately into a different window or anything like that. I can come in just like I did before. I can turn on these sketches if I wanted to and make changes to them. Or I could I'll do the different method this time. I'm going to click on that face and say extrude. Okay, I'm just going to start dragging up, and you'll see that it's going to cut through. Now, how far do I want to go? Well, I'm going to just say to object. I'll click this top face. Now, I want to make sure I'm only modifying this one part. So right here it says objects to cut, and sure enough, I'm only modifying that one body. And check out what happens when I say OK. I just grabbed that bottom face and I said extrude it up to this face. Okay. I got a warning for one of my positions. We'll deal with that here in just a second. But it was really simple to make that change. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to come in and let's just do a press pull on this, and I'm just going to drag inward whatever distance, right? And again, I could type in a number or whatever, but I'll just leave it like that. Say, okay, that looks good. I have clearance, etc. Obviously, I would take more time. It's just we're running out of time, so I'm not doing that. I'm going to say finish and edit in place. Okay. Watch what happens now. I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And you'll see saving two designs. I'm going to expand this open, and you're going to see it's going to change my version 2 to version 3 of my top level assembly, and then it's going to change the version of my piston assembly. So I'll go ahead and say OK. Let's take a look at our data panel, and you can see it's going to take a second for it to register, but these are going to jump. That's going to go to version 2 for the piston assembly because that's what we modified, right? And then this went to version 3. So I didn't have to open them up individually. I was able to kind of do it right in place. Now again, this is if you kind of do that top-down design where you're, you design a part, you save it, you design another part, you save it, and then you assemble them together. But you can make these changes like I showed here, editing sketches in context, or like I showed here with the edit in place. And these are all individually linked. Okay. And what's really cool is if I were to open this guy, let's go ahead and open that piston assembly. It's going to open it into its own design. Here is that offset face that we did right there. Okay, and here was that extrude that I did. So it actually added those features to the timeline. So it's like you're editing kind of in 3D. Okay, I know there's a couple other issues with this design. And a major one we're going to run into, I've been working forward actually on this part here, working on this, and once you start putting the gears in place, they actually overlap some of our holes and stuff, so we're going to have to make some major design changes when we get to there. This was probably the hardest part for me to figure out, like how do you measure things. So I'm going to show one more thing for you guys, kind of a cool little trick. If I go back into here, you'll notice there's an image. So I'm going to insert a canvas. I'm going to bring in this image. I'm going to say insert. And I'm just going to put it on this top plane here. And you can see there's a picture. Okay. I can rotate it around. I can, in fact, let's go ahead and rotate it 90 degrees. I can change the opacity of it so it's not quite so dark or whatever, but I'm just going to go ahead and say OK. And I now have this image on my sketch plane. If I expand this guy open, I can edit the canvas or I can calibrate. And this is the important thing here. So I'm going to say calibrate. And let's just look at the top. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to my camera here. So what I would do is, make sure that I'm zeroed out on my micrometer, and then I'm just going to measure across the width here. or the diameter, I should say. And in this case, I get 2.693. I don't think you guys can see that very well. 2693. So that's how big the part is. So now I can click, and again, this is kind of an approximation, so I'm going to pick the top edge and kind of the bottom edge and type in 2.693. And watch, my image will get bigger. Okay. Then what I would typically do is I like to have things kind of centered, so I might come in here and edit my canvas, and I'm just going to move the center circle kind of to the center of that guy there. I'll say okay, and now I can use this to kind of design my part. So I'll create a center circle, go out to this outside edge, and you'll notice that there's a little bit of an issue going on here, and I'm not going to go into too much detail. But when you take pictures of your parts, you get what's called parallax. It's due to lens shape and all that kind of stuff. So what people say to do is to move the camera far away and then zoom up as much as you can. Instead of holding your camera close to the part, you'll get like what's called parallax. Now this one, it's a little bit off, so I'm just going to go something like so. And I'm kind of looking at, I could type in the exact diameter, the 2.693, and it's pretty darn close. So what I would do now is edit my canvas, and then I would just move my canvas ever so slightly until, we're kind of lined up all the way around. And that's pretty good right there. Okay. Now I have something where I can say, okay, I know that there's supposed to be a hole here, there's supposed to be a hole here, et cetera, right? And I can dimension these accordingly. So I now know exactly where they are. This is not what I did when I started modeling this part, okay? But this is one way of doing, getting an image onto your design. So. Okay. Okay, so just kind of looking through Angelo's chats and stuff, it looks like everything's good. Hopefully, you guys learned something from this. You learned that I make mistakes, and sometimes we have to fix those. And so that's what I was showing, a couple different methods. Going back and editing sketches or editing in place, which is really powerful. When we go back and make changes, sometimes that causes downstream issues, and so we had to resolve those. So some tips and tricks that I typically do is as I'm going through my design, I'm kind of checking my work along the way. So I knew that those parts intersected probably about 3 live streams ago, right? But I left them in there because I wanted to have a topic to talk about how would you go about fixing this way downstream. Instead of just saying undo and change, we had to go back and make some major design changes. And I'm really excited about showing you how we're going to fix this issue in a future live stream. So remember, no live streams the next couple weeks. We'll probably start back up the first Thursday in December. So keep an eye out for that. Also, please sign up for AU, Autodesk University. Lots of really cool courses in there, everything from rendering tips and tricks to surfacing to assembly management. I mean, just scroll through and you'll see all of those classes. They're all online. I highly recommend attending those, and definitely attend the keynotes. Those are always really cool to watch to see what's coming out next. They usually do live demos of some new functionality. I have some of that new functionality I've been playing with. It's really darn impressive. I can't wait to show you. Basically converting meshes into solid bodies. It's really cool automatically. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.